Today we're going to discuss how to use a jigsaw. Jigsaws seem fairly simple and straightforward, but they can also be very complicated to get a good cut with, and that's what we're going to discuss today. We're going to go over some tips and some tricks to help you get the best cut possible with your jigsaw. Hi everybody, I'm Jim Dirdorf and this is Detroit DIY. Let's get jiggy. A jigsaw is a reciprocating saw, much like the reciprocator that you would use for demolition work. In fact, that technically is a jigsaw also, however, we just call this one a jigsaw. Jigsaws are not a saw that you're going to see on a construction site, maybe on a super rare occasion, but really never. Any plunge cuts, anything that needs to be plywood that need to be notched out is all going to be done with a reciprocator and not with a jigsaw. A jigsaw is something that you probably have in your workshop. You use it. You may have some cutting issues with it, such as cuts that are not 90 degrees or not square. I'm going to show you how we can correct that. And I'm also going to talk about blade selection and scroll cutting. Sometimes when using a jigsaw, you may struggle to get a 90-degree cut. As you can see, this is not a square cut, and there's a reason for this happening, and it's typically operator error, or you are not steering the jigsaw correctly. So that is the first thing we're going to talk about, is how to steer the jigsaw through your cut. I just want to add that a jigsaw can be potentially the safest saw in the shop. The only difference is typically when you use a jigsaw, you're cutting curves or you're scrolling with it. That's about the only time I get it out. I do not rely on it for a straight joint to butt two pieces of wood together, anything like that. It's mostly a scroll cut, or it's a cut that I just can't get any other saw into. And typically then I would go for the oscillator and not necessarily for the jigsaw. However, the jigsaw is different because when you are scrolling with it, you need to turn it and rotate it through these scrolls. And picture pushing a shopping cart backwards or driving a boat, something that steers from the rear, because that is how you steer the jigsaw, as you steer it from the rear. Typically, when you get an off 90-degree cut like this, it's because you're applying side pressure. You're trying to push the jigsaw to the side to keep the blade lined up with your mark, your cutting line. And when you do that, it puts a flex in the blade and causes it to do this. And rather, what you want to do to keep your jigsaw on your line is steer it from the back. Even very minute movements from the back of the saw will keep you on your line. The key to really getting a good cut with a jigsaw is just keep the blade on the line and don't put any side pressure on it. I discovered a long time ago that I like a jigsaw that's more compact or lower. Some jigsaws are very tall and the handle is up here. Those jigsaws to me are harder to cut with. You will produce more off 90-degree cuts with that taller jigsaw because of the fact that you'll find yourself trying to push it side to side to keep it on its mark rather than steering it from the back. I like this one a lot. The handle is offset more to the back of the saw anyway to promote you in steering it in that direction. The other reason that you can get an off 90-degree cut like this is blade selection. You've selected the wrong blade for the cut. Now typically that would be if you were doing a scroll cut and you had a wood type blade in it that is a much wider blade and not intended for scrolling. You want to make sure that you get a scroll blade. As you can see, this is a scroll blade and it's a much thinner blade, and this blade is going to allow you to do those curved cuts. Let's make some curved cuts. I also want to add that the jigsaws of today have this guide, this blade guide here. In the past, jigsaws did not always have these, and this does help your blade to stay straight, but I did make that off 90-degree cut with this saw simply by applying side pressure, knowing that that's what it was going to cause. I have this drawn out on here. It's not anything in particular. These are fairly easy curves. They're not tight curves. I could probably cut this without a scrolling blade, but we're going to go ahead and use the scrolling blade. I just want to say, in some instances, you may find it easier to control the saw, especially if you're just learning the saw, to grab it at the very back and to steer it in that manner. Also, when you're cutting a scroll like this with a jigsaw, it is not going to be perfect right out of the saw. You are going to have to sand this some to straighten it out a little bit and make it look like you want it to look like. Now let's take a look and see how our cuts are. As you can see, this is a 90-degree cut. There is no better accuracy than using the correct blade and using the saw in the correct manner to get that 90-degree cut. Several years ago, I worked for an elevator company building cabs and entrances. I finished elevator doors. However, when there were no doors to be finished, they would move me over into building the cabs. The very first task that they gave me when I went over there to help build cabs was cutting the service hatch in the top of the elevator, or what some people may refer to as the escape hatch. The elevator's roof ceiling is made out of 1.5-inch plywood. I was not well versed with a jigsaw, and that is what they cut that hatch out with. The very first hatch I cut was horrible. The cuts were way off 90 degrees. It was bad. It was so bad, in fact, that had to get thrown out, start over. They didn't let me cut any hatches for a while. However, they did give me scrap pieces of wood to practice cutting with the jigsaw to get 90-degree cuts. They taught me a lot of things in the use of this saw. How putting side pressure on this saw to get it to steer, keep the blade on your line, is bad news. You start putting side pressure on these and you will get a horrible off 90-degree cut. So remember, steer it from the back. I've just drawn some curves on here that are much sharper, and we're going to go ahead, we're going to cut that out. And like I say, just remember, steer from the back, no side pressure. Okay, there we go. And also, we have a very square cut. This is a 90-degree cut. No side pressure. Steer from the back. Let's talk about blades. For me, a jigsaw is something that I scroll with or I cut curves. Any other cuts on wood, I am not going to reach for my jigsaw first. However, some people do. You can make nice straight cuts for them. Per se, when you're cutting that escape hatch in that elevator, the entire maintenance or service hatch was cut out with the jigsaw, including the straight lines that intersected all 4 of the rounded corners. The jigsaw for me is just not the go-to tool when it comes to cutting straight lines. In fact, in some instances, if I have curved corners, I'll cut it out square and then I'll use the jigsaw to cut the curved corners on it. Also, sometimes when using the jigsaw and you are in an area, or you're starting an area where the wood like this is not a lot of room for the edge of the jigsaw to sit on, and some of this can happen. The best thing you can do is to just try and hold the jigsaw as square as possible as you can until you can get more of the jigsaw sitting on the platform of the wood. That is also why a jigsaw is not a good thing for cutting super narrow pieces like this, as it's important that both of these front feet and most of this platform is sitting on the wood when you're cutting. That'll also help you get a square cut. You can get metal blades for a jigsaw, and I have some right here. These blades are intended to cut 1/8 to 1/4 inch steel. I don't really cut that much steel, and if I did, I'd use my right angle grinder with a metal cutting wheel on it to cut that steel, and not necessarily a jigsaw. The only reason that I have these is I like to tooth count, and I needed a fine cut, and so I just grabbed these up off the shelf and I use them to cut wood, because they will also cut wood. Also with a jigsaw, typically the jigsaw cuts the wood as the blade is raising back up out of the wood. However, you can buy blades for plastic sheeting, Lexan, and other clear plastics where the blade is reversed, so it will cut on the downstroke instead of the upstroke. Those blades are strictly intended for plastic, and if you try to cut wood with them, you're going to find that your jigsaw is extremely jumpy, and you're going to have a hard time controlling it and handling it. Also, when you purchase your blade, you're going to see on the side of the package here, it's going to say clean wood. So this is a finer tooth blade, and it is intended to give you a clean cut with very little rip out as you're cutting through the wood. And typically, if you have a rip out issue, then you would want to put a piece of tape across the top of the wood, remembering that the blade is removing the material on its way up. So any tear out is going to occur on the top of the wood. These blades are not intended for scrolling. However, for a real light or a very gradual long curve, these blades will work just fine. The other thing I want to say is that when you are cutting a curve, whether it be with this blade or with a scrolling blade, you want to keep the saw moving. The blade will not remove any material if you quit pushing the saw. In fact, you need to keep about the same speed through the curves that you're cutting as you do when you're cutting it straight. And then of course the scrolling blades. The scrolling blades are very much thinner blade, which allows them to easily turn in the wood, because the thinner the blade is, the tighter it can turn. It can make the corner without the back of the blade binding or even the blade twisting. The blades will twist a little bit when you push them through the turns, especially if they're tight. However, these thinner blades will go through some pretty tight turns. Just remember to keep the saw moving. The blades that my saw uses are T-shank blades, and you simply lift the lever right here and remove the blade. The T-shank blades are very nice. Before the T-shanks, you had a set screw you had to remove, and you loosen it, pull the blade out, put the new blade in, tighten the set screw. The T-shanks are available from many different manufacturers, and they're an extremely useful blade, and they're quick change, and I really like them. The other thing I want to talk about is my saw in particular, and some saws have the ability to orbit. I do not necessarily use that feature, but if you can see right here, there's a slide switch. So when I push the slide switch this way, it turns the orbit off and it makes the blade just cut straight. What I mean by orbit is that the blade would have on the downstroke, then on the upstroke, the blade would move forward. and then it would pull back in, so the blade would oscillate like this as it's going through the wood. When you're cutting tight curves, you really don't want your jigsaw doing that. So if you have the option to turn that on and off, that is a fantastic thing. So as you can see here, it is turned off. And if you go this way, it is turned on. The other feature, this jigsaw is not variable speed, and I'm okay with that. I don't really need variable speed. The other option here is for a LED light. You can turn it on or you can turn it off, or a laser to keep your line on your cut. I do not like these lasers, and they throw me off more than they help me. I leave that off. The jigsaw also has the ability to do a beveled cut. This is a feature that I'm not so sure I completely understand, because boy, there's so many better choices to make a 45 degree or a 30 degree or a 22.5 degree cut than a jigsaw. So I don't really understand that feature. I don't use it. Mine gets locked in at 90 degrees, and there we go. That's pretty much what I use it for, is for scrolling. Alright guys, I'd also just like to add that the jigsaw is one of the safest saws that you can have in your shop. The only way you could really cut yourself with this saw is by sticking your hands underneath your workpiece while you're cutting the wood to prevent it from falling and you put your fingers under too far. Just be mindful of that. Support your workpieces, clamp your workpieces if need be. If the board is extended out really far, you may notice that the board gets a little jumpy when you're cutting it with the jigsaw. Secure it so that you get a clean, smooth cut and your board's not jumping all over the place. That's all we got for this time. If you enjoyed yourself, click on one of those videos. They're going to pop up next to me. And remember to always respect the power of your power tools. We'll see you soon.